In January 2025, the group Americans United for Life published a list of top 10 pro-life wins for 2024. Some items on the list had to do with pop culture and advertising focusing on unborn human life, including a Volvo commercial, a country music song, and the movie Dune Part 2's depiction of a baby in utero communicating with her mother.
Some other items on the list included legislation banning or limiting abortion access, and others had to do with the election of candidates the group considers pro-life, including the newly elected vice president.
For many Catholics who take the Church's moral teachings seriously, lists like this provoke questions. Should pro-life legislation be taken to mean only that which makes it harder to access abortion? The term pro-life was coined back around 1974, I believe, as part of the branding around the opposition to legalized abortion with Roe v. Wade. And it was intended very specifically to refer to the abortion issue, but even early on, many Catholics were saying, well, shouldn't pro-life mean all life? At the same time, some pro-choice advocates were saying, if you're so supportive of life, what about war? What about poverty or the death penalty? Then this idea that pro-life ought to refer to all life really began to pick up steam in 2016 in connection with critiques of the pro-life movement's alliance with the MAGA movement. So what should pro-life mean? Should it refer exclusively to opposing abortion? Should it refer to defending all lives?
And is it accurate to call a politician pro-life when they do things like support mass deportation, capital punishment, or relaxation of restrictions on gun ownership? What does it really mean to be a pro-life Catholic? That's what we're going to discuss on this episode of Glad You Asked.
Welcome to Glad You Asked, where we answer the questions about Catholicism that are easy to ask but not so easy to answer.
Hi, Rebecca.
Hi, Emily. How are you today?
I'm good. How are you?
I'm good. Something I've been thinking about that this interview that we did brought up was just how much our skyrocketing costs these days must be making everything harder for new parents, when that's just a hard time in life anyway. I remember when my oldest was a baby, it was pretty bad back then. He's in college now. But back then, the cost of childcare where I lived was so high, I couldn't even afford rent anymore. I was teaching at a community college, and my salary did not cover both rent and childcare. My child kept getting sick. He had to be hospitalized with pneumonia for a week. So I ended up moving. I don't know how parents of small children are surviving these days.
Yeah, I mean, that's horrible. I will say, having a kid really changed my perspective on what it means to be pro-life and support families. We also moved after we had a kid because we could not afford rent and daycare in Chicago, where we were living at the time, because that was where we both had jobs. And luckily, in the post-pandemic era, we both have careers that are possible to do virtually in an area where childcare is a little more affordable. But at the time, every single daycare in our neighborhood cost almost $3,000 a month for an infant, so significantly more than rent. I have good health insurance, and I still think, several $1,000s out of pocket when my son was born. Like you said, it just keeps coming. You figure out how to pay for housing and childcare, and then your kid gets sick, or you get sick, or your husband gets sick, or your parents get sick, right? Like life comes with uncertainties. And if it is and continues to be like this hard for my family with two parents who work, and we live in a low cost of living area, we have one car, we have a small house. What is it like for every other single parent of small children out there? Does the church really recognize the stresses that families are under when we talk about what it means to be pro-life?
Yeah, so many people I know from or I've known for years who are longtime pro-lifers. Some of them have kids who have health issues, disability issues. They are unable to cover the cost of care, even with dual income. And when I see lists of pro life wins, and I'm supposed to believe that a Volvo commercial was a pro life win, or Dune Part 2, which is a great movie, but I wouldn't describe it as pro life. There's a lot of killing. Or when I see politicians described as pro life just because they're trying to ban abortion and ignoring all of these other things, I have to ask, what about these policies that actually make it possible for people to have babies safely and to care for them?
And if people can't afford to provide the basics for a child, food and clothing and shelter, without working full time or without jumping through all of these hoops, moving like you and I did, right, to a different part of the country, and if they can't work full time without paying what is basically their entire salary for childcare, what does that mean about being pro life? Does the legality of abortion really become the primary pro life issue in that case?
And that's if we're just talking about the issue of abortion, unborn life. If we're just talking about what do we need to care for unborn humans, then we open up the conversation. What about all of the threats that exist to the lives of people who are already born? What does it really mean to be pro life in this context from a Catholic standpoint?
Those are some of the questions that today's guest is going to clarify for us. I'm Emily Santa, one of your hosts for the Glad You Asked podcast.
And I'm Rebecca Bratton Weiss. Before we get into the interview, though, let's take a moment to thank our sponsors.
Glad You Asked is sponsored by the Claretian Missionaries. The USA-Canada province of the Claretian Missionaries tends to the religious and pastoral needs of vulnerable communities. As part of a global congregation of Catholic priests and brothers, Claretians uplift the dignity of all people, especially those who feel overlooked or forgotten. To find out more and get involved, please visit www.claretians.org.
Now, back to the question of the day. What does it mean to be a pro life Catholic?
To help us answer this question, we talked to Bishop John Stowe, the Bishop of the Diocese of Lexington, Kentucky, a diocese that includes various underserved Appalachian communities.
Bishop Stowe is a priest in the Order of Friars Minor Conventual, and in keeping with the Franciscan tradition, has been a voice for justice for the poor. He has also spoken out repeatedly for environmental justice, immigrant rights, and LGBTQ inclusion.
Bishop Stowe, thanks so much for joining us on the podcast.
Happy to be with you.
So, I'm your next door neighbor over here in Ohio, and we just got some pretty wild weather. I didn't know if you'd been getting that in Kentucky as well.
Not right now, but I think we're going to.
I hope you can all stay safe.
Yes, thank you.
So, to start off our conversation, could you talk a little bit about what pro life means in the context of Catholic social teaching?
Sure. I think pro-life should be focused on the dignity of the human person and the sanctity of all human life. And I think too often the label gets connected to pro-birth or only referring to children in the womb and doesn't sufficiently take into account all of the dimensions of human life and the flourishing of human life that are the concerns of Catholic social teaching. So it runs the range from concern about creation to the prevention of war, to the treatment of the elderly, to the treatment of migrants. The list is pretty comprehensive.
So, why do you think that the term pro life has come to mean specifically or exclusively abortion in public discourse?
Unfortunately, I think it's been tied in recent years to the Republican Party platform and the ability for candidates to call themselves pro-life, even while they defend the death penalty, even while they are for what they would term Second Amendment rights, but really loose or no restrictions on guns, on weapons, and many other things that do not fit into our Catholic understanding of the life issues. But it goes back further than that. When Cardinal Bernardin first used the term in the 1980s, there was already opposition to, when he spoke about a seamless garment to be the comprehensive term for pro-life issues, there was concern that it would take away from the issue of abortion, and overturning Roe versus Wade was a primary concern for the Bishops' Conference and a primary concern for a lot of Catholics for decades.
Yeah, so pro-life it's a convenient political slogan, right? but what are some of the limitations of this framing?
Well, I mean, think about the opposite of it. We don't call, pro-choice and pro-life were framed as polar opposites, but they're not mutually exclusive in our normal understanding of the words, right? And sometimes the so-called pro-life people would refer to pro-choice people as pro-abortion. Many of them would say they're personally opposed to abortion, but believe the question is about who should be able to make the choice. Our Catholic position is that this is a sacred life, and when it comes to abortion, there are two lives that have to be considered. It's not either the life of the mother or the life of the unborn child, but both of them. But when we say pro-life and it only involves the abortion issue, it just leaves out too much of what's important about life. And then even in the aftermath now of Roe versus Wade, the reversal of Roe versus Wade, and the state legislatures have the authority to legalize or criminalize abortion. The problem is how many places have made abortion illegal, but also have restricted so much access to health care for the poor, for mothers, so much access to all kind of help, including food aid for the poor, that it makes it very difficult for people in crisis pregnancies to be able to bring a child into the world.
So I think a lot of us who are Catholic have kind of grown up with an understanding of pro-life as meaning anti-abortion, and a lot of people's views have changed over time. Can you talk a bit about how your understanding of what it means to be pro-life has changed or developed over the years?
Sure. I remember being involved in the pro-life movement in high school, and I remember being impressed by Cardinal Bernardine's seamless garment at that same time and realizing how we had a great consistent ethic of life. We had a great consistent framework for understanding all the life issues. You know, one of the hats that I wear is as the Bishop President of Pax Christi USA, and Pax Christi was early in the pro-life movement because it was a life issue as much as war, and the violence of war was a life issue. But it has narrowed over time to the current understanding. I don't think my understanding of it has broadened, except to now understand creation as really a life issue. Because how do we sustain life if the planet is not making it possible for people to live with any kind of security? Why do we have so much migration? Why do we have people that live in islands in the oceans are worried about the rising oceans and eliminating their land altogether? Farmers in Central America not having typical growing seasons. And so in a place that's already suffering from abject poverty and already contributes to global migration, we're going to see more and more people for survival going to places where they can live in the developed world.
So it seems like part of the disagreement over what it means to be pro-life is about people's opinions on the place of legislation and political activism, right? And that goes for the conversation about abortion, but I think it also goes into the conversation about, are we anti-death penalty, right? Do we act to end the death penalty in certain states? So I was wondering if you had any thoughts about the role of legislation in being pro-life and whether there are maybe other more effective ways to support life across people's lifespan beyond legal bans.
Sure. So before it was the focus on legislation, it was the focus on overturning the court decision, the Supreme Court decision. Now that that's returned to the state, then it has a lot to do with legislation. I think we've seen since Roe v. Wade was overturned that in a lot of states that were considered red states and considered to be places where an anti-abortion agenda would be strong, it actually had the reverse effect when given to a popular vote, probably because of some of the extremist positions of criminalizing not only abortion, women getting abortion, not only abortion providers, but the women themselves, and even people transporting people across state lines, or doctors trying to treat women with ectopic pregnancies or other difficult pregnancies. So I think that had a negative effect on getting the kind of legislation that would make abortion rarer rather than completely illegal. The better approach, I would think, as Catholics is the programs like Walking with Moms in Need, advocating for the kind of wraparound services that mothers need. look at the cost of childcare in the United States. I mean, many people have to choose not to work because if they were at, instead, if they weren't having a high wage job, they could pay more in childcare for the time that they're working than they were actually earning. And so there was a crisis in many states, in Kentucky where I live, with childcare. There's not sufficient childcare. There's a lack of access to natal health care or prenatal health care. There's a lot of the issues that would make it very supportive. And even parental leave. The United States is terrible, even though some places are getting better at it. The United States is terrible about having parental leave. And the Catholic Church itself has to look at our own operations. How many places do we provide parental leave while calling ourselves a pro-life and pro-birth church?
It's a much more constructive way to think about building up a pro-life society, right?
I mean, we want children born into the world to be wanted. We want children born into the world to have what they need to flourish. And we want to lift more and more people out of poverty or help people lift themselves out of poverty with the appropriate social supports. But it doesn't seem to me you can have it both ways. You can't cut out abortion as a legal option for people. As much as we would like to see that option gone, we can't have abortion gone as an option and no support provided for mothers, especially single mothers.
So that touches on one of the common concerns that people in the pro-choice movement have about pro-life activism is that they argue that there's a kind of neglect of the dignity and the rights of women. What does it mean to uphold both the dignity of the unborn and the dignity of women, especially in conversation about abortion?
Yeah, I think it goes to the fact of recognizing there are two lives at stake, not just one. And I think both are possible. I think our Catholic tradition argues very well that both are possible. But unfortunately, much of the anti-abortion rhetoric has to do with punishing women and making women feel bad about their sexual activity, where there's nothing comparable for the men involved. And so there is kind of a double standard that is being employed that can easily lend to the concept that women are being discriminated against or their rights are not being recognized. I think the Catholic Church, especially with a male-only hierarchy, has to go out of its way to listen to women and to their real concerns when we make pronouncements and when we talk about what the moral and righteous thing to do is. And I don't think we always have a great record of doing that.
You've talked a lot throughout about the seamless garment, and that I think is really, you have lived that out in your own ministry, right? You've spoken about LGBTQ plus rights, gun violence, and immigration, and put all of these within the context of our pro-life beliefs as a church. So I was hoping that you could speak a little more here on how issues like that connect to Catholic teachings on the value of life and why it's so important for you or for others in the church to continue to make these connections explicit.
Sure. And to do that, as I was preparing for this interview, I went back to 1972 when the seamless garment phrase was first used by Eileen Egan of Catholic Worker and Pax Christi. And in 1983, when it was popularized by Cardinal Bernardine, the issues that they were talking about had to do with torture, had to do with genetics, had to do with abortion, had to do with war, had to do with capital punishment, euthanasia, care of the terminally ill, pornography, hunger, homelessness, unemployment, education, sexism, racism, genocide, welfare reform, the care of single mothers, birth technology. And there were several other issues. And to that, I think the only one that has been added in more recent times is the ecology or the concerns about creation. So these are not new things. And perhaps the LGBTQ question has been added because when people, Pope Francis gave us the important phrase that the way to say thou shalt not kill in our time is thou shalt not exclude. Because when certain people or categories of people are excluded, that's practically a death sentence. And so these are very much pro-life issues. When we look at the statistics about how many especially transgender, but also gay and bisexual, lesbian young people are committing suicide or are on the verge of committing suicide, it becomes a life issue. And especially if they're getting reinforced rhetoric about how they are disordered, less than human, sinful again and again, and become problematic to their family and live in a kind of shame that they want to escape from. When we talk about gun violence, think about the killings of the children, and we've seen so many of them. Each time I think we're going to say enough is enough, and it doesn't happen. But the case that really stands out in my mind is in Uvalde, Texas. And I think of Archbishop Garcia Sierra in San Antonio as a real exemplar of what pro-life teaching is all about, where he went to each of those families, where he went to each of the homes of the victims, where he created a Catholic school to take these kids in, and where he even met with the family of the shooter. And I think he really explained the whole purpose of our pro-life approach is looking at the individual and seeing those lives as sacred, mourning their loss, and then trying to preserve life. So it really is baffling to me. It was always baffling to me how people could be pro-life on the abortion question and not about capital punishment. Well, then you get into the question of, well, abortion is dealing with innocent life and capital punishment is about hardened criminals and guilty. Well, we know that's a flawed argument to begin with. But even if we took it at face value, how do you defend school shootings and making it easy access to guns? I don't understand that. So I think a narrow focus doesn't really give enough credibility to our Catholic teaching.
So yeah, like you, I was involved in the pro-life movement from my teenage years, and many of my friends were too, and almost all my friends and many others who are Catholic across the United States have become uncomfortable with the pro-life label because of some of its political associations. How would you respond to those Catholics who feel concerned about that?
Well, I know where their concern is coming from. In the Commonwealth of Kentucky, we have to distance ourselves from the Right to Light movement, as it's self-called in Kentucky, because they are anti-gay, they are anti any number of things that really have nothing to do even with the abortion question. So it becomes a seamless garment of another kind where all kinds of so-called conservative issues are lumped together. And so I understand those concerns, and what I would say to Catholics is to understand what our tradition has to say about what being pro-life means, and to take another look at the seamless garment approach.
Yeah, and so to kind of flip the question a little bit and again kind of ask it in a more constructive way, what are some ways that individual Catholics can start to build a culture or a life that is genuinely pro-life, just kind of in their daily lives?
Yeah, so I would say we start with the really central teaching about the basic dignity of every human person. And if we really root ourselves in what that means, and it means how we deal with each other, Pope Francis points us to the Good Samaritan. What does it mean to be a neighbor? The neighbor is the one who cherishes life and promotes its flourishing. Then it's going to affect the way that we vote, not just on the abortion question, but about the way that resources are shared in our culture and our society, and how we treat the most vulnerable, how we treat the most poor. When we read about those who are suffering, it's easy to be moved by the plight of a person facing cancer or a terminal disease. We also have to be moved by those who are facing terminal hunger and constant economic insecurity. We have to be moved by those who are dealing with mental illness and the stresses of isolation that lead people to be suicidal. But it starts with that basic recognition that the human person is sacred, and the human person is called by God to flourish in this life, and the community is essential to the flourishing of individuals.
So, Pope Francis had a vision of a synodal church that accompanies people wherever they are in their faith journeys. What does this vision of the church have to offer for the pro life ministry of the church? How can hope and accompaniment help build a consistent ethic of life?
That's a great question. So, accompaniment begins with meeting the person where they are. And I think that was very much Pope Francis's approach to evangelization as a whole, as well as to synodality, as well as to all of the different components of ministry in the church. We start by meeting people where they are and walking with them. Synodality involves listening intently to people and also presenting, bringing facts, bringing history, bringing things, because none of us has all the answers. And so we bring things to light, but not in a way that is wagging the finger or condemning the other person, but bringing new information to light in their experience without condemning, but rather as an invitation to live more fully this life of faith. And, the great example that we can point to is the Easter story that we hear during the season of the road to Emmaus. And it was Pope Francis who pointed out for me that Jesus not only meets the two disciples who are walking away from Jerusalem, not only listens to their story and allows them to tell him his own story, not only is sympathetic to them and empowering them to tell a story, and then gets himself invited, but he walked with them going in the wrong direction. Right? And so if we're willing to take those kind of risks and walk with people, think we'll understand a little bit better what synodality is all about, certainly understand what pastoral care is about. And one of the great words that Francis used throughout his pontificate is accompaniment. I think people will much more appreciate accompaniment than being told what to do.
We always end these interviews in the same way by asking people, what is one thing that you want listeners to take away from this conversation?
The one thing I want listeners to take away is an understanding of the sanctity of life being much broader than just a prenatal question. I think we have to look at the immigrant and recognize that sending people outside of the country and warehousing them in a jail in El Salvador is certainly not consistent with being pro-life. Not allowing people to receive asylum when they're breaking away from violent threats to their own livelihood or their families, or the inability to feed their families. That's not being pro-life. Wanting people to have the so-called right to die is not being pro-life. It's recognizing the sanctity of human life, all of its forms.
Well, that's all our questions for today. Thanks again for such a wonderful conversation.
Thank you. They're very thoughtful questions.
Wow, that interview was amazing. Bishop Stowe really beautifully explicated what a Catholic pro-life ethos should look like.
Yeah, that was really great. And now our producer, Sarah, is going to join us for our usual post-interview discussion. Hi, Sarah.
Hey, guys.
Hey, was there anything that surprised you? And I want to go first because I always wait for you two to, I always wait for you two to answer, and then you've stolen my ideas. So I want to go first this time. And I don't know that this was something that surprised me, but Rebecca, you asked that question about what he would say to people who might feel alienated by the pro-life label because of how it's been used. And I just want to say that I was so glad you asked that. And I was so glad that he answered that by basically saying, I don't blame you. Because I think that, as someone who does struggle to identify myself as pro-life sometimes, like that was just really reassuring to hear and really important to hear. And I think we need to hear that more often from voices in the church who have authority, like Bishop Stowe. And so I just want to say like how glad I was that he said that.
Yeah, I really appreciated that as well. And I also just really generally appreciated how he reframed what it means to be pro-life, just not as a political stance, but as like a consistent ethic that is rooted in human dignity. But I was mostly just struck by how candidly he acknowledged the political baggage. I don't know that I've really heard that so explicitly from a bishop.
Yeah, I thought it was amazing for me, even after all these years, to hear these issues articulated and connected with one another in the light of Catholic theology from a bishop. What I especially appreciated was we talk about the seamless garment a lot, and that's a phrase that's popular in consistent life ethic groups and which has kind of been trashed by some other Catholics who view it differently. And he used a phrase, I think it was like a seamless garment of a different kind, where he was talking about how the anti abortion legislation has been linked up with the wrong garment instead of being connected to all of these pro life initiatives as it should be. Support for life, support, all of the things we were talking about, Emily, plus, capital punishment, war, environmental justice, anti racism. It's been bundled with all of the bad stuff. And I've been thinking about that ever since we talked to him.
Also, can I just say like, how glad I was that he gave credit for the seamless garment of life to Eileen Egan instead of Cardinal Bernardin? Props to Bishop Stowe.
Yeah, it's one of my big complaints has frequently been that so many people who talk about this issue haven't done their research. And I feel like they should all listen to Bishop Stowe because he is speaking from a really deep awareness of the issues. And just as you mentioned, giving credit to the person who actually came up with the term shows just how deeply he's looked into it.
Yeah, I feel like so much of what we try to do here at US Catholic is to kind of change the narrative a little bit so that to get kind of beyond or deeper than the two sides that fight at each other or that scream at each other. And I felt like this was a really beautiful example of how he just changed the narrative a little bit so that we could kind of get beyond this like pro-life, pro-choice, pro-choice that may happen and just tell like a different, more important story a little bit.
Yeah, I would like to know or to hear more from him about what like effective preaching or leadership looks like in other places where pro-life might have a narrower cultural meaning right now, and like practical ways that pastors can open up the conversation like he did in this episode.
Yeah, I think that gets at our next question, which is, do you wish you could have asked for any more information or gone deeper into anything? And I think that's a really good point. Like, are there other places where this is happening really well in the Catholic Church, where these discussions are happening? Because I'll be honest, I haven't seen them, and we're pretty engaged in kind of Catholic intellectual discussions around social justice issues and Catholic social teaching. And I felt like this was really one of the first times I had seen this done so well.
Yeah, like I said, I've been paying attention to these discourses for a long time. And while the bulk of my criticism is directed at kind of more conservative leaning pro lifers, I also have a lot of critiques to make of what seem to be incredibly superficial critiques from pro choice feminists who are not looking at all of these interconnected moral issues. But yeah, I think it highlights what Bishop Stowe was articulating, highlights what a rich moral tradition the Catholic Church actually has, and how sad it is that we're not drawing on that. How sad that we're just using these kind of culture war sound bites, which are often very anti-science and which ignore the voices of many, many Catholics. But for something I would have liked to have had more information on, I kind of would like to bring up this uneasy reality that often in societies where abortion is banned, which we would call a pro life legislation, it does not correlate with good results. That's kind of a big question I have is can we talk about whether these bans are necessary to be pro life if they end up producing more harm than good?
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. So moving to our last question, if you were going to preach a sermon on this topic, what would your main takeaway be?
If I were preaching on this, I think I would want people to see that being pro life is not about opposition, it's about action, and specifically building a world where like everyone can thrive.
Yeah, I wanted to say, well, this whole thing was a sermon, so I have nothing to add. But I think I think my main takeaway would be I think for many progressives or people who consider themselves pro-choice and pro-life, there's this common narrative that like, well, the other side is engaged in kind of the political activism, and if you're pro-choice, then you stay out of the politics of it all. And I think Bishop Stowe did a really good job of kind of shifting that and saying, no, Catholics are called to be politically engaged, just pro-life political engagement should be constructive rather than destructive. And so I think my sermon would be about what it means to be constructively involved in a pro-life political movement.
So I think I would give kind of an educational homily in which I would say if you care about life, if you really care about life and you are serious about wanting to protect life, whether it be unborn human life, or all life at all, that requires work. It's more than just a slogan. Do the research, find out again what works, what has correlated with good outcomes as far as reducing abortion, what legislation works, what is the connection between one injustice in one area of life and another injustice in another area of life. If you really care, you will do that work and you will seek to understand, even if that means having to change your mind about things.
Well, that's our show. Thanks again for joining us. We're glad you asked. If you enjoyed the episode, please tell your friends about the podcast or leave us a review or rating on whatever podcast platform you listen to. It helps more people find our podcast.
Do you have a question you'd like to hear answered on our show? Email us at editors@uscatholic.org. And please join us next week when we talk about what a Jubilee year is. This year, in recognition of our 90th anniversary, US Catholic is offering a special subscription deal. Subscribe or renew your print subscription for 1 year, and we'll give you a free gift subscription to share with a friend. Visit uscatholic.org/gift to learn more, because great conversations and great Catholic journalism are meant to be shared.
Glad You Asked is hosted by me, Emily Sana, along with Rebecca Bratton-Weiss, with assistance by James Chung McKenna. We're produced by Sarah Butler-Schuler, with sound engineering by Nathaniel Hunter and art by Megan Avery.